Hello and welcome back to the ezeep API Postman video series. In this video we're going to use the ezeep API to print a file that we uploaded in the previous video. We will also be able to print with a file URL. So let's take a look at the documentation and see which endpoints we need. Okay, so we have a post request. Here's an example of the API. And we have two different versions here. Print a file referenced by URL and print an uploaded file. There's very little difference apart from this file ID here. This file ID is the response we got back from when we prepared a file upload, and it's simply just the file URL of the blob storage in Microsoft Azure. So if we can just use any other file URL, then we should, because then we can just avoid the upload process. But we can just put that instead. And what we're going to do is, instead of creating two different endpoints, we're going to create this one. I'm just going to delete this one. We don't need this one. So we're going to create this one. This will be using the file ID, and then we can simply duplicate it by pressing this button here once we've saved everything. So it's much faster because we only need to change one line anyway. Okay, so let's begin. Let's take a look at the documentation. And where's the uploaded file? Okay, so here's the endpoint, which is a post request. And we can just pop that in here and change this to post. Okay, so what else do we need? I need some headers, I believe, which will be in the documentation. And here's the example request. So we need a content type and authorization header. And that will be application JSON. So it looks like we're sending JSON data, and this is going to be the JSON data. So let's do the headers first. You know how to do the authorization. We've done that plenty of times now. And is it reading from our variable? Yes, it is. Okay, so we need to add another one, and that was, what did we say that was? We can just copy and paste it to make sure we don't make any mistakes. Content type application JSON. And what else do we need? According to the documentation, okay, that's enough headers. We have our post, which is sfapi/print. And we need to add data to the body. Now, according to the documentation, we are sending JSON data, so we just need to make sure this is set to raw. Yes, it is. We have different options here: form data, form URL encoded, and we have raw, and then we can select text or JSON or HTML here, but that's already set up for how we want. And because we're sending JSON data, we need to put it in JSON format. So let's create our JSON object, which starts with 2 curly brackets, and then we have the data that we find in the documentation, which is going to be this file ID, printer ID, and then type PDF. This file ID we have saved as a variable, and then printer ID we can just copy and paste from our get printer request, and then the type we can just hard code because we know it's going to be PDF. Okay, so the file ID, everything, because it's JSON data, everything needs to be in quotations, and then the file ID, even though we have the variable, we still need to wrap the variable in quotation marks. And then the curly brackets. And then make sure we spelled that correctly. File ID, yes, with an uppercase I, okay. And then a comma, and then we need to add the printer ID, which we can just get from our get printer request. Highlight this, and then Control C, and we can just paste it in here in quotation marks. Comma, and then we go into type, which is PDF. So we can add some properties here as well, but let's just make sure this request works first. That should be everything we need. We have two headers: authorization bearer access token, content type application JSON, and we have our endpoint is post. Okay, so let's try this. Okay, so there's our job ID. That's good. So now let's add some properties just to explore what else we can do. So we're going to put a comma here, and then properties, also in quotation marks, and then that's going to be an object. And what do we have in the properties? Well, we have a bunch of things here. So we can set duplex, color, or paper ID. We're going to set the paper ID. And how do we find what paper ID we set it as? Well, we can go to our printer properties, and to find the ID, we can find auto there, A4. Okay, so that's the fourth one down. And 1, 2, 3, 4. So media supported ID 9, and we can set that as paper ID number 9. Yep, colon there. Okay, let's see if this works. Yes, we have a job ID. Great. And I can hear my printer going as well, so that looks like it's working. Now, just to set up a separate one just for the file URL, we can make sure we save this. That's saved, and then we can just duplicate it, which should show everything here. Yes, everything is the same, but we're going to change this to file URL. And then we can grab a test file as well. So if you go to the documentation, there's a file test URL which you can use, which you can just copy and put it in between these quotation marks. And we can now we can test if that works as well. If we just rename this print by file URL. No, that won't work because I added this printer ID as well. That was silly. Okay, let's try that now. Yes, super. Okay, so now we have an endpoint to get an access token. We can get a list of printers. We can get a list of properties that are part of that printer. We can prepare a file upload. We can upload the file, and then we can print either with that upload, or we can just print with a file URL as well. Now the last part is just to get the job status of each print job, and for that we will just need this print job ID. And I will show you that in the next video. See you there.